Have you ever felt like you were being quietly evaluated in a relationship? Like every reaction, every text message, every emotional response was being measured? You sensed that something was happening beneath the surface, but you couldn't quite name it. One day he feels warm, present, connected. The next day he feels distant, guarded, unreadable, and somewhere in that emotional shift, you begin questioning yourself. What did I do wrong? Why did he pull back? Is he losing interest? Or is he testing me? This is the painful truth no one talks about. When you're involved with an avoidant man, you often feel like you're in an unspoken interview, not because he's consciously calculating your worth, but because his nervous system is, his attachment wounds are, his fear of closeness is, and without realizing it, he starts running quiet tests to decide if you are safe, if you are too much, or if you are worth the risk. And here's the part that hits deep. Those tests can make you feel like you are the one on trial, like your love, your patience, your emotional depth is being examined under a microscope. But before you internalize that as rejection, you need to understand what's really happening. Avoidant attachment doesn't mean he doesn't care. It means closeness activates fear. It means intimacy feels both desirable and dangerous. It means somewhere in his early emotional programming, connection was tied to overwhelm, pressure, loss of independence, or emotional unpredictability. So instead of communicating those fears directly, his system protects itself the only way it knows how. It creates space, it observes, it pulls back, it tests. And if you've been feeling confused, anxious, or emotionally off balance, it's not because you're weak. It's because attachment dynamics are powerful. When someone pulls away, your nervous system reacts. When someone goes cold after being warm, it feels destabilizing. That's not drama. That's biology. But here's what changes everything. Once you understand the tests, you stop failing them by abandoning yourself. You stop chasing. You stop overperforming. You stop shrinking to prove you're worth it. Instead, you respond from grounded strength. Let's talk about why avoidant men test instead of communicate. Avoidant men rarely wake up thinking, I'm going to test her today. This isn't a conscious strategy most of the time. It's an unconscious protection mechanism. Direct communication requires vulnerability. And vulnerability feels risky when you've learned that emotional dependence equals loss of control. For an avoidant man, closeness can trigger a fear of engulfment. He may enjoy your presence deeply. He may admire your strength, your warmth, your consistency. But the moment he feels himself needing you, the moment he senses emotional reliance forming, an internal alarm goes off. It whispers, careful, you could lose yourself here. You could get hurt. You could be controlled. So instead of saying, I'm scared of how much I care about you, he pulls back to see what you'll do. Instead of saying, I need reassurance, but I don't know how to ask, he becomes quiet and watches your reaction. Instead of saying, I'm afraid you'll overwhelm me, he creates distance to measure your intensity. Testing becomes safer than expressing fear. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. Observation feels safer than exposure. And here's where it becomes emotionally complicated for you. Because when someone distances themselves, your instinct might be to move closer. When someone becomes quiet, you might try to fill the silence. When someone pulls away, you might chase, not because you're desperate, but because you care. But in the avoidant mind, chasing confirms his fear. It tells him closeness equals pressure. It tells him emotional intensity equals loss of freedom. So he withdraws further, and the cycle begins. This brings us to the first major test. He pulls away to see if you chase. At first, everything feels natural. There's connection, there's chemistry, there's conversation. You feel momentum building. Then suddenly, something shifts. His responses get shorter. He takes longer to reply. He seems distracted. Maybe he says he's busy. Maybe he says nothing at all. And you feel that drop in your stomach, that subtle panic, that urge to restore the connection. This is one of the most common avoidant tests. He creates emotional space to see how you handle it. He's subconsciously asking, will you stay steady, or will you abandon yourself to keep me? If you flood him with messages, if you demand reassurance, if you try to force closeness, it reinforces his fear that intimacy equals suffocation. But if you respond with calm self-possession, if you continue living your life, if you don't collapse into anxiety, something shifts in his perception. Because what he's really measuring isn't how much you want him, it's how emotionally stable you are when connection fluctuates. That doesn't mean you suppress your feelings. It doesn't mean you pretend not to care. It means you don't chase someone who just created distance. You allow space without punishing. You maintain dignity without playing games, and that's powerful. But here's what's important to understand. Passing this test does not mean ignoring him to make him jealous. It doesn't mean becoming cold or strategic. It means being secure enough to let someone have space without losing yourself. Secure energy is calm. It doesn't beg. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't spiral into worst-case scenarios. It says, if you need space, I'll give it, but I'm not pausing my life for it. And that grounded response is unfamiliar to someone who expects chaos. Now let's talk about the second test. He shares something vulnerable and then watches your reaction. This one is subtle. He might open up about a painful past relationship. He might mention childhood tension. He might reveal a fear of betrayal or a history of being misunderstood. And for a brief moment, you see behind the wall. But after sharing, he becomes observant, quiet, alert. What he's testing here is safety. Is it safe to be seen by you? Because vulnerability feels like exposure, and exposure feels dangerous when you're not used to emotional security. If your response turns into interrogation, if you overanalyze his trauma, if you become his therapist overnight, he may shut down. Not because you did something malicious, but because intensity feels overwhelming to him. If your response turns into emotional flooding, crying, panic, or attaching deeper immediately, he may interpret that as emotional instability. But when you respond with grounded empathy, when you hold space without trying to fix him, when you acknowledge his pain without absorbing it, something powerful happens. You show him that vulnerability doesn't equal chaos. And that stays with him. Now the third test can be the most destabilizing emotionally. He creates inconsistency. Hot and cold behavior is not random. It often reflects internal conflict. He feels drawn to you. He enjoys closeness. He feels the chemistry. But when that closeness starts feeling too real, too intimate, too necessary, he retreats to regulate himself. So one week he's attentive, affectionate, expressive. The next week he's distant, distracted, emotionally unavailable. You're left confused, replaying conversations in your mind, trying to decode the shift. But here's what he's observing during this push-pull cycle. Can you handle uncertainty without collapsing? Avoidant men are hyper-aware of emotional volatility. If inconsistency causes you to lash out, demand, or spiral, it reinforces his belief that relationships are emotionally draining. But if you notice the inconsistency and calmly address it, or calmly step back if needed, you disrupt the pattern. This doesn't mean tolerating breadcrumbs. It means recognizing when someone's internal conflict is surfacing and deciding whether that dynamic aligns with your standards. Inconsistency feels addictive because it activates your nervous system. When connection returns after distance, it feels like relief, like a reward. Your brain releases dopamine, and that emotional high can make you tolerate lows you normally wouldn't accept. That's not weakness, that's attachment chemistry. But awareness gives you power. When you understand that hot and cold behavior is often a test of emotional stability, you stop taking it personally. You start asking yourself a more important question: is this dynamic healthy for me? And that question changes everything. Because at the end of the day, while he may be testing you to see if you're worth it, the deeper truth is this: you are also evaluating him. You are deciding if his emotional availability, his consistency, and his communication align with the life you want. You are not on trial. You are in choice. And the moment you shift from proving your worth to protecting your peace, the entire dynamic transforms. You are not on trial. You are in choice. And the moment you truly understand that, something inside you settles. The anxiety that once pushed you to prove yourself begins to quiet down. You stop trying to win someone over who isn't sure about you. You start observing instead of performing. And that shift alone changes how an avoidant man experiences you. Now let's move into the fourth test, because this is where things become very revealing. He challenges your boundaries. It may not be obvious at first. It can look small. He cancels plans last minute and says he forgot. He shows up late consistently. He makes subtle jokes that feel slightly disrespectful. He pushes physical or emotional limits just a little further than you're comfortable with. Then he watches, not aggressively, not dramatically. Quietly, he's observing one core thing. Will you tolerate behavior that feels off just to keep me? Avoidant men are deeply sensitive to control and restriction. Ironically, this can make them test how much control they have. If you accept every broken plan, every vague excuse, every moment of emotional unavailability without saying anything, he subconsciously registers that you will bend. And bending feels safe to someone who fears confrontation. But it also lowers attraction. Here's the truth that can be hard to hear. When you over-accommodate, you may think you're being loving, patient, understanding, but to someone who respects strength and independence, it can signal that you don't value yourself enough to speak up. This doesn't mean you explode. It doesn't mean you threaten to leave over minor issues. It means you calmly acknowledge what doesn't work for you. For example, when he cancels last minute, instead of saying, "It's okay, I understand," while feeling disappointed inside, you say, "I understand things come up, but I value planning. Let's reschedule when you're sure." That's not drama, that's clarity. When he makes a joke that crosses a line, instead of laughing to avoid tension, you say, "I know you're joking, but that doesn't sit well with me." You don't attack, you don't shame, you don't beg. You simply draw a line and stand behind it. And here's what happens internally for him. Respect grows. Because the real test wasn't whether you'd tolerate him, it was whether you'd tolerate yourself being diminished. When you hold boundaries calmly, you communicate something powerful. I want you, but I don't need you enough to betray myself. That energy is stabilizing. It tells his nervous system that closeness doesn't equal chaos, it equals clarity. But when boundaries are consistently violated and dismissed, that's no longer a test, that's a pattern. And patterns require decisions, not patience. Now let's talk about the fifth test. And this one can hit directly at your insecurities if you're not grounded. He mentions other women. It might be subtle, a story about an exes, a compliment about a female coworker, a casual comment about someone finding him attractive. It may seem harmless on the surface, but something inside you tightens. Is he comparing me? Is he trying to make me jealous? Is he testing my reaction? In many cases, yes. He's measuring your emotional security. He's watching to see if you spiral, interrogate, compete, or withdraw. Avoidant men are often uncomfortable with intense emotional reactions. If mentioning another woman triggers a wave of jealousy, accusations, or insecurity, it reinforces their fear that relationships bring emotional instability. But here's the deeper layer. Sometimes he's not trying to provoke you. Sometimes he's subconsciously trying to confirm his desirability while maintaining distance. Mentioning other women creates a buffer. It reminds him he has options, and options feel safe to someone who fears dependence. If your reaction becomes possessive or combative, he feels cornered. If your reaction becomes competitive, he feels pressure. But if your reaction is calm and secure, not dismissive, not fake, just grounded, something shifts. You don't need to prove you're better than anyone else. You don't need to claim ownership. You simply hold your value. You might say nothing dramatic at all. You might simply continue the conversation without emotional charge, or if it feels inappropriate, you calmly express that. Jealousy in itself isn't weakness, it's human, but how you respond to it reveals your self-trust. And this is important. Emotional security does not mean pretending you don't care. It means knowing that if someone wants to choose someone else, you let them, because your worth is not dependent on comparison. When he senses that you are not competing, not panicking, not shrinking, something powerful happens. He realizes he cannot destabilize you by introducing scarcity, and scarcity is often the silent weapon in avoidant dynamics. Now we move into the sixth test, and this one is one of the most common in avoidant attachment patterns. He delays commitment conversations. The relationship grows. You spend time together. There's intimacy. There's emotional investment. But when the question naturally arises, what are we? He shifts. He changes the subject. He jokes. He says, let's just see where things go. He might say he doesn't like labels. He might say he doesn't want to rush, and you're left suspended in uncertainty. What he's testing here is pressure tolerance. Will you force me into something before I feel ready? Avoidant men often equate commitment with entrapment, not because commitment is inherently restrictive, but because their nervous system associates it with loss of autonomy. So when you bring up exclusivity or future plans, it can activate anxiety. Now here's where many people unintentionally push the dynamic into collapse. They demand clarity immediately. They issue ultimatums from a place of fear. They over-explain their needs repeatedly, hoping repetition will create security. But secure energy approaches commitment differently. You express your desire clearly once, you state what you're looking for, you communicate your standards calmly, and then you observe. For example, I'm looking for something exclusive and intentional. If that's not where this is headed, I understand, but I want to be aligned. There's no pleading, no anger, no pressure, just clarity. And then you give space for his response. If he avoids the conversation repeatedly without movement, that's data, not something to argue with, data. Because while he may be testing whether you'll pressure him, you are testing whether he can meet your timeline. Healthy relationships require mutual readiness, not indefinite waiting. And here's something deeply important. Respecting his pace does not mean abandoning your own. You are allowed to want commitment. You are allowed to desire clarity. You are allowed to define your standards without apology. When you hold that position calmly, you send a message that changes the entire power dynamic. You're not chasing security from him. You're deciding if he aligns with you. Now we come to the 7th test in this sequence, and this one can be emotionally intense. He watches how you handle his silence. Silence from an avoidant man can feel like rejection. Hours go by without response, maybe even days. There's no explanation, no reassurance, just absence. And your mind starts filling in the gaps. Is he losing interest? Is he with someone else? Did I say something wrong? Is this over? Silence activates attachment wounds. It touches old memories of being ignored, unseen, forgotten. It can trigger the inner child who once felt abandoned. But for him, silence is regulation. It's space to breathe. It's a return to autonomy. And he's observing, will you unravel when I disconnect temporarily? If his silence leads to emotional flooding, long paragraphs, accusations, frantic calls, he may interpret that as confirmation that closeness equals instability. But if his silence is met with grounded patience, not passivity, just steadiness, he experiences something unfamiliar. He experiences a woman who is not dependent on constant validation to feel secure. That doesn't mean you accept ghosting. There's a difference between needing space and disappearing irresponsibly. Patterns matter. Context matters, but isolated silence, that's often a test of emotional independence. You don't need to match his silence with games. You don't need to post strategically to provoke him. You don't need to punish him by withdrawing affection when he returns. You simply continue living your life. And here's the shift that empowers you deeply. Instead of asking, why is he silent? You start asking, how does this silence make me feel? And is this dynamic aligned with what I want long term? Because this entire journey is not about passing his tests perfectly. It's about discovering whether you feel safe, valued, and emotionally fulfilled in this connection. Avoidant men test because they fear vulnerability, but you grow when you stop trying to pass and start evaluating. And that is where emotional power lives. Because when you stop trying to win someone's approval and start observing how their behavior impacts your nervous system, you reclaim something that may have slowly slipped away in the push and pull, your center. Now let's go deeper. Here's something most people never consider. While he may be testing you, he is also testing himself. This is the hidden truth. Behind the distance, behind the silence, behind the inconsistency, there is an internal dialogue happening inside him that you don't see. Am I safe to love? Will I lose myself? What if I depend on her and she leaves? What if I open up and it overwhelms me? What if she needs more than I can give? Avoidant men don't just test partners, they test their own capacity for intimacy. When he pulls away after a deep moment, it's often because the closeness scared him. When he goes quiet after expressing feelings, it's because vulnerability exposed him. When he creates distance right when things feel stable, it's because stability makes the stakes real. He may deeply care about you. He may think about you constantly. But caring means risk, and risk means potential pain. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior. It doesn't mean you tolerate inconsistency forever. It simply gives you clarity. He is not always testing to see if you're good enough. Sometimes he's testing to see if he can handle loving you. And that shift in perspective can soften resentment. But softness must never replace boundaries. Because here's where the line becomes important. When these tests turn into emotional manipulation, everything changes. There's a difference between unconscious attachment, fear, and intentional control. If his silence becomes punishment, if his distance becomes a way to gain power, if he gaslights your concerns and tells you you're too sensitive, if he creates confusion intentionally to keep you insecure, if he gives just enough affection to prevent you from leaving but never enough to feel safe, that is no longer a fearful attachment pattern. That is a dynamic that erodes your self-worth. And this is where you must become radically honest with yourself. Are you explaining away patterns that hurt you? Are you minimizing your intuition? Are you labeling red flags as just avoidant behavior? Attachment wounds explain behavior. They do not justify repeated emotional harm. A healthy relationship, even with an avoidant partner, still includes accountability. It includes effort. It includes growth. If he never reflects, if he never adjusts, if he never shows willingness to meet you halfway, then the testing becomes a trap, and you deserve more than surviving someone's fear. You deserve mutual effort. Now let's turn the mirror gently back toward you. Because here's a question that changes everything. Are you testing him too? You may not call it that. You may not realize it, but in subtle ways, you might also be measuring him. You might withdraw to see if he notices. You might delay responding to see if he pursues. You might bring up other admirers to spark jealousy. You might overextend yourself hoping he'll finally commit. These behaviors aren't manipulation, they're protection. But they create a cycle where both of you are observing instead of connecting. Testing blocks intimacy. When two people are both guarded, both watching, both calculating, no one feels safe enough to soften. And this is where the breakthrough happens. What if instead of trying to pass his tests, you simply show up consistently as yourself? Clear, calm, direct. If you need reassurance, you say it once. If you need clarity, you express it once. If you feel hurt, you communicate it without attack. And then you observe his response. Does he lean in or lean out? Does he reflect or deflect? Does he move closer or retreat permanently? Because at the core of all these tests lies one simple truth. A man who truly values you will not want to lose you. Yes, he may need space. Yes, he may struggle with vulnerability. Yes, he may move slower. But he will not repeatedly choose behavior that risks losing you without caring about the consequences. That's the difference between fear and indifference. Now let's talk about something deeply emotional. Why do these tests hurt so much? Because they activate old wounds. When he pulls away, it can feel like childhood rejection. When he goes silent, it can feel like being ignored. When he delays commitment, it can feel like not being chosen. When he mentions other women, it can feel like not being enough. And if you've ever struggled with feeling unseen, unworthy, or easily replaceable, these moments cut deep. That's why you might overreact sometimes. That's why your heart races when his tone changes. That's why you replay conversations at night. It's not because you're dramatic. It's because attachment wounds are loud. But here's the empowering part. Every test is also an invitation to regulate your nervous system, an invitation to build self-trust, an invitation to stop abandoning yourself in moments of uncertainty. When he pulls away, can you stay grounded? When he goes quiet, can you soothe yourself? When he delays commitment, can you hold your standards? When he challenges boundaries, can you protect your peace? These are not just responses to him, they are investments in you. And over time, something powerful happens. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop over-explaining your value. You start embodying it. And that embodiment changes the dynamic entirely. Because avoidant men are drawn to emotional stability. They may be triggered by it at first. They may pull back when they feel it, but they respect it deeply. A woman who is secure does not threaten their autonomy. She complements it. She does not demand constant closeness. She chooses intentional connection. She does not collapse under uncertainty. She observes and decides. And when you become that version of yourself, not for him but for your own growth, you no longer fear the tests. You see them for what they are: information. Now here's where this journey becomes truly transformative. You realize that whether he chooses you or not does not define your worth. Read that again slowly in your mind. Whether he chooses you or not does not define your worth. If he cannot move past his fears, that is his work. If he cannot meet your standards, that is his limitation. If he cannot offer consistency, that is his capacity. It is not a verdict on your value, and the moment you internalize that, something shifts in your energy. You stop trying to be the perfect woman who passes every test. You stop editing yourself to avoid triggering him. You stop shrinking your needs to appear low maintenance. You show up fully. And paradoxically, that's when healthy attachment becomes possible. Because true connection does not require you to perform. It requires you to be authentic. Now imagine this for a moment. Imagine responding to his distance with calm curiosity instead of panic. Imagine expressing your needs without fear of abandonment. Imagine walking away from inconsistency without resentment. Imagine choosing someone who chooses you without hesitation. That version of you is not unrealistic. She is built through awareness. And right now, by understanding these tests, you are building her. The goal is not to outsmart an avoidant man. The goal is not to win psychological games. The goal is not to become emotionally unavailable yourself. The goal is to become secure, because when you are secure, you don't fear tests. You pass them naturally, or you walk away naturally. And both outcomes protect your peace. So if you've been feeling confused, evaluated, or uncertain in your connection with an avoidant man, take a deep breath. You are not crazy. You are not too much. You are not asking for impossible things. You are navigating attachment dynamics that most people never learn to name. And now that you see the pattern, you hold the power. Because at the end of the day, the real question isn't whether you're worth it to him. The real question is this: is he emotionally ready for someone like you? And if the answer is unclear, remember this: you are not here to convince someone to love you. You are here to align with someone who can. And that realization is where everything becomes clear. Because once you stop asking, how do I pass his tests, and start asking, is this connection nourishing me, you step out of survival mode and into self-respect. Now we move into something deeper, something that most people never say out loud. Sometimes the real test is not about your emotional stability. It's about your willingness to walk away. Avoidant men are incredibly sensitive to shifts in control. If they sense you are emotionally dependent, they feel powerful but pressured. If they sense you are grounded and capable of leaving, they feel both respect and urgency. And this creates an unspoken dynamic. He may unconsciously push to see how much you'll tolerate. He may delay clarity to see how long you'll wait. He may offer breadcrumbs to see if you'll accept less than you deserve. But the moment he senses that you are not afraid to lose him, something changes in the energy. Not because you're threatening him, not because you're playing games, but because you're no longer operating from fear. Fear chases, security chooses. And avoidant men feel that difference immediately. Now let's talk about the deeper emotional layer behind all these tests. Avoidant attachment is built on self-protection. It often develops in environments where emotional needs were dismissed, minimized, or met inconsistently. So the child learns, I don't need anyone, I'll handle it myself. Independence becomes identity. Emotional detachment becomes safety. But here's the paradox. Even the most avoidant man still desires connection. He still wants to feel understood. He still wants to feel chosen. He still wants companionship. He just doesn't want to feel trapped. So when he meets someone who feels intense, emotionally available, expressive, it creates both attraction and fear. You represent warmth, you represent depth, you represent vulnerability. And those things are beautiful. But to someone who equates vulnerability with risk, beauty can feel dangerous. So he tests, not because you lack value, but because he doubts his own ability to handle intimacy. And this is where your compassion must meet your boundaries. You can understand his fear without sacrificing your needs. You can empathize with his past without accepting emotional starvation. You can hold space without losing yourself in the process. Now let's address something crucial. There is a massive difference between slow and stagnant. Avoidant men often move slowly toward commitment. They may need more time to integrate feelings. They may require space to process emotions. That's not inherently unhealthy. But stagnation is different. Stagnation is when months pass with no progress. Stagnation is when conversations repeat with no resolution. Stagnation is when you feel stuck in ambiguity indefinitely. And ambiguity drains your spirit. You start overthinking. You start analyzing every text. You start questioning your intuition. You start negotiating with yourself. Maybe if I'm more patient. Maybe if I don't bring it up. Maybe if I prove I'm not demanding. And slowly, your standards begin to blur. This is where many strong women lose themselves, not in dramatic heartbreak, but in subtle compromise. They shrink their voice. They silence their needs. They downplay their desire for commitment, all to avoid triggering his fear. But here's the truth that sets you free. You are not responsible for regulating a grown man's attachment wounds. You can support, you can communicate, you can grow together, but you cannot carry the emotional labor alone. And when you start carrying everything, resentment quietly builds. You begin feeling unseen. You begin feeling undervalued. You begin feeling emotionally lonely in a relationship. And loneliness inside a connection hurts more than being single. So the real empowerment comes when you shift your focus from his tests to your truth. Ask yourself, do I feel safe expressing my needs? Do I feel consistently respected? Do I feel emotionally fulfilled? Do I feel chosen? Not occasionally, not when it's convenient, but consistently, because consistency is what heals attachment wounds. Not intensity, not chemistry, not passion alone. Consistency. More. Now let's talk about the emotional breakthrough moment. There comes a point when you realize you cannot love someone into security. You cannot be patient enough to fix his fear. You cannot be perfect enough to eliminate his doubt. You cannot be quiet enough to prevent his withdrawal. His growth must be self-driven. And this realization can feel painful, because part of you wants to believe that if you just respond correctly to every test, he'll finally relax. But relationships are not exams, they are collaborations. And collaboration requires two willing participants. When he senses that you are no longer trying to prove yourself, when he sees that you are emotionally steady, whether he leans in or pulls away, when he realizes that your presence is a gift, not a guarantee, he faces his own decision. Step forward or step out. And this is where your power peaks. Because if he steps forward, it's from genuine choice, not pressure. If he steps out, you don't crumble. You grieve. You process, but you remain intact. That's security. Security doesn't mean you don't feel pain. It means you don't lose yourself in it. Now imagine the kind of love that doesn't require testing. Imagine a connection where clarity replaces confusion, where communication replaces silence, where vulnerability is met with reassurance instead of retreat, where commitment is mutual instead of negotiated. That kind of love exists, but you cannot access it while clinging to someone who continuously tests your tolerance. And this is the final emotional truth. You are not here to be evaluated. You are here to be valued. You are not here to pass someone's subconscious survival strategies. You are here to build something stable, intentional, and reciprocal. So if you've been feeling like you're constantly being measured, constantly trying to respond perfectly, constantly analyzing how to avoid triggering distance, pause. Take a breath. Place your hand on your heart for a moment. You are already worthy. Not because you handled his silence well, not because you stayed calm during his distance, not because you tolerated ambiguity gracefully. You are worthy because you exist, and the right partner will not need to test your value repeatedly to see it. They will recognize it. So as you move forward, remember this. Let him observe. Let him take space. Let him process. But you stay grounded. You stay clear. You stay aligned with your standards. Because the ultimate test is not whether you can handle an avoidant man. It's whether you can remain true to yourself while loving one. And if loving him requires you to betray your peace, silence your voice, or accept less than you deserve, then the most powerful thing you can do is choose differently. Not out of anger, not out of ego, but out of self-respect. You are not a candidate in someone else's emotional audition. You are the prize. And the moment you fully embody that truth, the tests lose their power. Because you no longer fear the outcome. You trust yourself enough to handle it.